And I just thought your work is so good. I want to put it out there into other fields. And I thought maybe we could apply this in philosophy of religion if we use like Russell, Bertrand Russell. Someone asked him, Mr. Russell, what happens if you die and you see God? What do you say to God? And he says, not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence. And I wonder if we could apply this here and just say, like, on the conditional that God does exist, um, could he have an entitlement to expect Russell to believe, even though he didn't have the evidence? Let's take Russell at his word and say, he just didn't have enough evidence. Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedecase, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest questions in philosophy, theology, nature, and life with experts in those fields. I really love thinking about cool stuff, so you're invited to come think with me. Today's episode is another special one. I always say that, but I wouldn't have them if they weren't special to me. I have with me again Dr. Sandy Goldberg, and Sandy is a professor of philosophy at Northwestern. And recently, he also became a professorial fellow at the RK Center at the University of St. Andrews, which is huge. They're both huge. So this guy is so utterly productive. It's unreal. It's crazy. He was just doing all this work at the APA, and he's here back on the podcast today. So I'm really, really grateful for him. I love the way he thinks. Today we're going to be talking about what you should have known, and I think it has all sorts of implications in theology, in apologetics, in the theist naturalist debate, as well as just philosophy and epistemology more generally. So I'm really excited to talk with Sandy right now about this, and then I'm excited for you, the listener, to grab what he's worked on and run with it in your various subdisciplines and different related fields. So I'm really excited. Before we jump in, though, I want to thank everyone over on Patreon. If this is your favorite podcast, if this is top 5, top 10, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. I always feel like I'm on the WTTW. This is brought to you by viewers like you, but it really is. So you can find a link in the description, wherever you're getting this podcast episode, to my Patreon. And you can give at various levels of support, and you get all sorts of prizes at different levels. So check that out, and please consider becoming a Patreon patron. All right. So without further ado, let's get in. We're going to be talking about what you should have known with Dr. Sandy Goldberg. Sandy, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
Parker, it's fabulous to be here. Thank you for inviting me back.
Yeah, last time we talked about brains and vats and disquotational speech and such, and it's been really helpful since. I've thought about it earlier today. I was listening to a live podcast episode on Mind Chat. And they were getting into semantic externalism, and I was like, man, because of Sandy's work, I know what they're talking about. So
that's great. That's really great.
Yeah, so we covered that, and that was some of your work from a while back. But now we're going to getting into something a little bit more recent that you've been working on, what you should have known. And I'm really, really pumped about this. Do you remember why this sparked interest for you?
I do. I actually have a very vivid memory of exactly the moment in which I thought there's a question here that would be worth pursuing. I had just given a talk at I think it was at the University of Iowa, and we went out for a beer afterwards, and we were having a conversation that was actually not distinctly philosophical. And one of the people had said to me after I made a comment, well, Sandy, you should have known that. And I thought to myself, what could that mean? Well, it could mean that I have the evidence and I just didn't realize that I had the evidence. And on the basis of that evidence, I could have known it. But in this case, I didn't have the evidence. And yet I still had the feeling that the student was right. I should have known that. And so I wanted to make sense of it. And that's where this project emerged from.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, so there you specify there's different cases, there's different ways that you could take this question or this phenomena of should have known. But the one that you have in mind in this paper that we're pulling from is that there's these cases in which a subject should have known a proposition, even though, given her state of evidence at the time, she was in no position to know it. And it's kind of controversial, and we'll get into that. But real quick, this core analysis of it, you say that, and this will be hard for a podcast, I guess, but that's why we're talking through it. S should have known that P when 1, another person has or would have legitimate expectations regarding S's epistemic condition. 2, the satisfaction of these expectations would require that S knows that P, and 3, S fails to know that P. And so that's really good. It's really easy when you see it. It's a little bit harder when you hear it. Sandy, can you give us an example of this?
Sure. Let me just back up just a bit first to make the point that you made in passing. There are all sorts of ways in which we talk about each other as you should have known this, you should have known that.
Mm.
For example, there's a really nice example that's owed to the ethics literature, where I might forget my mother's birthday, and if I forget my mother's birthday, and she calls with, she's hurt by this. She said, "Sandy, you should have known yesterday was my birthday." There's a case where I did have the evidence. In fact,
Mm.
there's a sense in which I actually even knew it. I just didn't act on that knowledge. And
Yeah.
so sometimes we do describe that as a should have known case. There are other cases where, for example, imagine a bunch of detectives who have all the evidence needed to arrive at the right diagnosis of what's gone on, but they just didn't put two and two together.
Yeah.
We might say that they should have known, only they had the evidence. The cases I'm interested in are the cases where we say you should have known something even though you didn't have the evidence.
Yeah.
What's my thought here? The core analysis you just talked about, it is actually a rather straightforward idea. It's that sometimes people expect me to know things and I don't know them. And the fact that I don't have the evidence doesn't give me any claim against their claim that I should have known them. So that's what I was trying to capture in the core analysis.
Yeah. Oh man, that's so good. Real quick, Sandy, I think that your mic's bumping in your lapel just a little bit,
Okay.
and it's bumping. So just yeah,
Okay.
it sounds better. There we go. Perfect.
Okay.
I just a random thought kind of popped up about thoughts and like not all of our thoughts are current thoughts or knowledge, and I wonder just how much that comes into play when it comes to those cases of your mom's birthday. So you know when your mom's birthday is, presumably, but you forget. Um, do you still have that knowledge? Like it's not a current. It's not. I don't know. I'm thinking in philosophy of mind terms. It's not like part of your access consciousness right now or anything like that. But what do we make of having that information but not recalling it? Just a brief. Sorry to digress here.
No, that's okay. It's you make a nice connection with the between epistemology and the philosophy of mind. I am Parker still inclined in that case to think that I know it. Here's one piece of evidence. If you stopped me right then and there and said, "Hey, Sandy, when's your mother's birthday?" I could give you the answer very quickly.
Okay.
If for example, if the question occurred to me at the time, "When is your mother's birthday?" I would have quickly known that it was that day.
Mhm.
So these are all grounds for thinking that I actually did know it, but I just didn't bring it to mind. And I'd point out that the idea in philosophy of mind, I think the idea that we have long-term memory, that itself is based on the idea that it's somehow there represented in memory. It's just that it's not being actively, as you said, accessed.
Mhm.
It's not in working space, if you like to put it that way.
Yeah.
So I think it does make sense to say that I knew it. I just didn't act on it. I didn't bring it to mind, as it were, in the way that I ought to have.
Okay. Okay. Um, so so we went over the core analysis here, and then you have this controversial claim. Um, it's that there's these 3 conditions, and they're sometimes jointly satisfied. It's like
Yeah.
can you just, flesh that out a little bit more for us? Like, why is that so controversial?
So here's a way of seeing why it's controversial, and to get it why I may have to do a little bit of background
Yeah.
in contemporary epistemology, but the thought that you should have known something even though you don't have the evidence on the basis that it would be required to know it. Many people will say, well, look, there are lots of things that we there if that's true, if it's actually true that you should have known it, the flaw is going to be something other than an epistemic flaw. It's not going to be a distinctly epistemic flaw.
Yeah.
And the controversial part of my claim is that it's a distinctively epistemic flaw if you should
Right.
have known something and you don't. Why is that controversial? For 2 reasons. One, the should that I'm using there it's not the should of epistemology. It's the should of, if you like, it's kind of an interpersonal should.
Hmm.
Um, it's the should. We can talk about this in a bit, and I'll be happy to say more. But it's not an epistemic should. And the thought is that um, uh, if that's true, and if it is anything like a moral should, we often expect, many people expect, that we have control over what we should do or should
Hmm.
not do. And so, if this is really something more like a moral should, then it would imply that if we should have known something, then we should have believed it. But of course, we don't have control over what we believe, and so this is one of the reasons why it's controversial. But
Yeah.
a second reason why it's controversial is that many people think that when it comes to our evaluating one another from an epistemic point of view, the only thing that really matters if we're interested in evidence at all is the evidence that a person has. If they don't have evidence that they should have had, that might be a kind of failing, maybe a professional failing, maybe an interpersonal failing, maybe a failing as a parent, but it's not an epistemic failing. And the controversial claim that I'm making in the paper is that in fact it can be an epistemic failing.
Yeah. Oh, it's so good. Uh, I think I have another chance to bring up one of my favorite words is doxastic voluntarism. I love
Yeah,
that so much. If you were a doxastic voluntarist, meaning you could choose your beliefs to various degrees, but I mean, people are all over the map on that. But then this wouldn't be as big of a problem because, yeah, you should have changed your beliefs. But um, as far as I know, that's not a very popular theory in epistemology today. Is that right?
that's correct. It's not just that it's not a popular theory. That even suppose you are a doxastic voluntarist, the position you just characterized runs into another problem, which is this, and it's a problem that I've often been confronted with, even not as a doxastic voluntarist, but I think it's worse for the doxastic voluntarist. The thought is this: wait a second, are you saying I should choose to believe something for which I currently have no evidence? How
Yeah.
could that possibly be rational? And
Yes.
the thought is that that's a challenge. That's something that you have to have something to say about. I do have something to say about that. I think the doxastic voluntarist also has to have something to say about that.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. If we're holding someone responsible um, for not knowing something you should have known, but you don't, we're going to hold you responsible. And the person in that position, S, the subject, is like, "Do you want me to make a non-rational leap here?" And if it's non-rational, does that even count as knowledge? Then now we Edmund Gettier enters the chat, and we bring about Gettier problems and such. I When I first read this, I thought of ought implies can, and a lot of people, a lot of people in more popular level philosophy, like we talk about this all the time, and I thought a similar case here that it's like, uh, if ought implies can, and you're holding me responsible for something I could not have known, but I ought to have known. It seems like we're violating this ought implies can principle. What do you think about that?
So I think that's interesting on many levels. I'm inclined, ought implies can is one of these principles where I'm not exactly sure what I want to say. I
Mm,
tend not to like to say anything inconsistent with it, not because I believe it, but because I know that if you say something inconsistent with it, the burden is on you to say
uh,
what you think about ought implies can. But the other thing is, when I often think about epistemology as a discipline that puts us in a position to evaluate one another's beliefs, or, if you like, credences. More generally, their doxastic states. Where I'm not entirely sure that for the evaluation to be proper, we don't need an ought implies can principle. So I might say, all sorts of things that talk about all sorts of standards that, in the best kind of world, one ought to fulfill, and that can be true even if a particular person couldn't right now, given her competence, she couldn't fulfill it. So I would point out that the ought implies can principle is relevant only if we treat the should have known phenomenon as something that is beyond a merely evaluative claim. And
mm,
I haven't thought all that much about whether I want it to be beyond a merely evaluative claim. Um, if I did, I'd have to think more about ought implies can.
yeah. Okay. Okay. So, Kasim Kassam has talked about like how possible questions, and just how is this phenomena possible? And I thought about that when I was reading your paper. How is your paper seeking to answer? Is your project seeking to answer the how possible? How is this phenomena possible? Given that maybe we take it. Maybe we're particularists and we say, look, I don't want to develop necessarily a method for given, but I'm a particular. We have this phenomena. We know about it. Is your project to like elucidate how it's possible, or what would you? How do you consider your project with the should have known phenomena?
So with Kasim, as I recall, it's been some time since I read the book where he focuses on that. I seem to recall that he was interested in what I would call deep metaphysics, the deep
Mm,
metaphysics of how possible claims. Um, I'm not so much interested in the deep metaphysics here.
Mhm.
as I am interested in making sense of how we actually evaluate one another.
Yeah.
You are absolutely correct, Parker. It's a nice observation. In that sense, I'm interested in how is this possible? How can we maybe how can this be a practice that makes sense?
Yeah.
That we hold one another to these standards. It appears to be a kind of epistemic criticism when we say of someone that she should have known when she didn't. How can that be, given that we have these views in epistemology that seem to make this an impossibility? So, in that sense, I am engaging with the how possible question, but it's really to make sense of our practices more than the deep metaphysics, if you like.
Yeah. That's something I noticed, with your colleague, Dr. Jennifer Lackey as well, that maybe it's a Northwestern thing, but you guys take, common phenomena and things of everyday experience, and you say, like, "We're gonna go in deep, and we're gonna get clear on these things," but it's not just, it's very practical. This has everyday implications, and I think that's really cool. Her stuff, a lot of her stuff has to do with law. You just wrote a paper for, was it the New York Times? I can't remember.
No,
Um,
the Chicago Tribune.
yeah, yeah, the trip.
Yeah.
Okay, and can you just briefly, what was the title of that?
I've forgotten the title of it, but it was about
Sorry.
it was about, I should have practiced this before the podcast, but it was about the recent case, the Ghislaine Maxwell case, and I was trying to think about what kinds of criticisms can be made
Mm,
of those surrounding her, and I noticed that a lot of people were talking about those who clearly knew what was going on and did nothing. And I think that's an important point to make. I think there were many people around Ms. Maxwell who knew what was going on and did nothing. I was also interested in trying to see if we could make the case that it's often that there are many people who should have known, where ignorance is actually no excuse.
yes.
You should have known. And so what I was trying to do in that little op-ed piece was point out that when we are assessing these kinds of cases, these terrible cases like the Maxwell case, but also more generally, we can be held to standards where our ignorance in certain respects doesn't excuse us from being held accountable to those standards. So that was the point that I was trying to make.
Hmm.
I think it's called the real lesson of the Ghislaine Maxwell case. I think that's what it was.
Okay, that sounds right
Yeah,
from when you said, I should have
yeah,
known it too.
yeah.
Well, I brought that up because I think it's so important that philosophers are talking about real stuff and being in papers again, in newspapers. Who better? I just have such an admiration for philosophers, and I just want a higher, a larger voice and a larger influence on the culture, I guess. But let's make more philosopher kings in my mind. So I'm really excited about that. So everyone, go find that as well if you want to see the even more real world application for epistemology and should have known stuff, which is just fantastic. You brought up ignorance, and as I was reading this paper, I just thought the hook I had already, the concept or the hook to hang my concepts on was culpable ignorance, and I thought maybe you could help us distinguish. Is this a within the family of culpable ignorance? Is it a cousin in a related field? What do you make of the should have known phenomena in comparison to culpable ignorance?
Good. I think the culpable ignorance debate goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle recognized that there are things that can excuse us when we haven't done what we should have done. Obviously, not having the ability to do so might be an excuse. Arguably, it actually gets you off altogether, and it's not true that you should have done it. But even suppose that I'm supposed to pick something up, but I break my arm and have to go to the hospital. That's clearly an excuse. Aristotle noticed that also ignorance can be an excuse, that if you don't know something, that actually can be. So if suppose I don't know, for example, that I don't know some of the facts. So I'm serving a particular drink. This one I think goes back to a discussion about the nature of reasons. But I'm serving a particular drink to a friend of mine. What I don't realize is that I picked up what happens to be a cup of petrol or gasoline rather than water. You shouldn't give somebody a glass of petrol. It's toxic. But I didn't realize that was petrol. So it might well be that when you're assessing my performance, what I did, you'd say, well, Sandy didn't know that, and the fact that he was ignorant that it was petrol actually excuses his behavior. We wouldn't say that he did something that was not the thing to do,
Mhm.
but we will excuse him for it. So Aristotle noticed that not all ignorance excuses. Sometimes your ignorance is itself culpable or blameworthy. And so when you are to be blamed for your ignorance, then in fact then in fact your ignorance doesn't excuse you. So if somebody had said to me, Sandy, be careful, about 2/3 of the cups around here actually have petrol in them. And suppose I heard that, but then I immediately forgot it because I wasn't paying attention. You might say that then my ignorance was blameworthy. It's culpable, and so it doesn't excuse me.
Hmm.
And what I wanted to do in this paper is see, have I just basically come up with a new kind of culpable ignorance? And what I wanted to argue is that the should have known phenomenon is different, in part because it doesn't necessarily imply blame. There are cases where you should have known something, where you don't know it, albeit through no fault of your own. So it was very important to me in the paper that I say this is not just another form of culpable ignorance, precisely because your ignorance may actually be blameless, and yet still you should have known.
Hmm.
Um, so that's why I do think it's different. The kind of case that I give is a case involving role responsibilities. If you have role responsibilities, those responsibilities might include responsibilities to know certain things or check certain sources. And if for some legitimate reason you weren't aware of those role responsibilities, that doesn't mean you don't have them,
Hmm.
and you might fail to satisfy them. And I give a couple of examples in the paper itself about how this might happen.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really good. I think of I just initially was thinking of this movie, Knives Out. Are you familiar with this movie at
Yes,
all?
yeah, good movie.
So yeah, yeah, great movie. So the nurse accidentally gives the wrong medicine to her patient, and I don't know if I should spoil. It's been out for a while, so sorry everyone. But it turns out to not actually be poison. But if it were, I think she should have known that it was the right that it was a different vial. But then it there's this weird case where the nephew switched the labels on the vials and all this stuff, and so things get more complicated throughout the course of that. But um, I think about speeding, and if I get pulled over and I tell the police officer, "Sir, I didn't know the speed limit. I didn't see a sign," and he goes, "Well, that's no excuse." That would be like a case of culpable ignorance. Um, I'm trying to think of a position where my position is driving, and there's like a should have known, like if I was a truck driver and I didn't pull over to the way station or something like that. Um, is that does culpable ignorance and should have known, do they align in some cases and then depart in others? Is there kind of this interweaving like that, or
It's going to depend on our analysis of what are the conditions on culpable ignorance, because
Mm,
some people think that culpable ignorance can always be traced back to a condition when you were fully knowledgeable about the likely effects of what you were going to do, but you were either weak-willed or you went forward anyway. And in that kind of case, it won't be like my should have known case, in
okay,
part because you will have had evidence that would have put
yeah,
you in a position where, if not that you'd know, at least you'd be justified in believing something related.
mhm,
So to give concrete cases, imagine that, for example, I'm on a team of scientists, and I am supposed to, as a member of the team, I'm supposed to do a literature search every month and report back to the team on whether there's any new developments. And suppose I learn that early on that there's only going to be a 50% chance that there's going to be relevant literature, and somebody who's actually very knowledgeable tells me that. It's testimony that I have, but I decide not to do it anyway. You might say, look, there it's culpable ignorance, because I had evidence that there's a 50% chance that there's going to be a new development, and I
mhm,
decided to ignore that. That would be culpable ignorance, but not a should have known in my case, in my sense, because there you actually had some evidence.
okay.
I'm interested in the more radical case where you didn't have evidence at all, and yet still you should have known.
D
So that's why they do. It's going to depend on how we analyze the culpable ignorance cases.
Yeah, okay. So, when it comes not the should have known case, you don't have evidence. Does that include like culpable forgetfulness? Like at the moment, I don't have it anymore because I forgot it and I don't have access to it. Like it's out of my memory. Or does this mean like you had no contact with the relevant evidence at all?
That's a really nice question, and I haven't thought about it. But my thoughts off the top of my head, Parker, would be this: the standard kinds of forgetfulness cases, the cases that we see in the ethics literature, like I forgot my mother's birthday. There's a case where I definitely had the evidence.
Yeah.
I just didn't call it to mind. You're wondering what happens if there's a case where I had evidence, but I forgot it, and I literally forgot it, and I can no longer recall it under any circumstances.
Yeah.
Then I'm inclined to think if we think of that as a forgotten evidence case where the evidence is no longer in my possession, then it will be a should have known case in my
Okay.
sense. So
Okay.
it's going to depend on a theory of what it is to have evidence, especially under conditions where we forget things.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
what you're getting at.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. And I think you could probably even break it down even further and say, well, I got hit in the head with a rock, and so that would be different than I just didn't recall it enough to keep it in my memory or something, and one might be more culpable or should have known more. Like if there's external events that caused me to forget, than if I just let things go and then I lost it completely. This is so good. This is so fascinating. Such fascinating stuff. Um, I wanted to talk about the main sources of legitimate expectations regarding
Yep.
another's epistemic condition. So I expect that you should have known. The grad student expected that you should have known, and I just want to go over like what are the sources that lead us to expect others to know things.
So I find it helpful in addressing cases like this to start with real life examples. So think of the kinds of things that you expect from I don't know, for those of you who are graduate students, the kinds of things that you expect from the chair of your dissertation committee. Think of the kinds of things that you expect from the other faculty in the department. If you are a faculty member, think of the things that you expect from the chairperson in your department. These are all things where either because of the roles they play or because of the relationships they have with us, we actually have certain expectations. Those expectations, it's important to point out, are often normative and not merely predictive. So when I expect that for example, the chair of my department knows such and such, I'm not merely predicting that she knows such and such.
Mm,
I'm actually holding her accountable. That is, if she doesn't know such and such, then she is to be downgraded because she violated an expectation to which I was entitled, a normative expectation to which I was entitled.
mm,
Where do these come from? I think they come from our roles. They come from social practices. When we participate in social practices, especially if they're norm governed, if they're governed by norms or rules, we entitle others to expect us to know those rules. So think of a very simple case. If you are playing in a European football, what we in the States we call soccer, but European football league, and you're a member of the team, everyone is going to expect you know the rules. And it may happen that you actually never sat down and learned all the rules. That doesn't matter. If you violate one of them, they will say to you, "You should have known. You should have
yeah.
known that rule." It doesn't matter that you never learned it in the first place. Um, those are the kinds of things that might generate these expectations. What I wanted to point out was that the expectations themselves are legitimate only if the practice whose norms they reflect is legitimate, and that's a good question. When are these practices legitimate? It's a great question in social philosophy or political philosophy that I've thought only a little bit about. I'm
Yeah.
happy to try to spitball with you here, but I would be lying to you if I told you that I have a good theory of it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. So again, though, these norms are not epistemic. They are interpersonal norms.
Yep.
Um,
Or I think in the paper I call them practice-based norms. They derive from practices.
okay. A helpful clarification, I think, would be um, we can hold people morally responsible for violating interpersonal norms, right?
Yes.
Do we hold people morally responsible for violating epistemic norms?
I think we do. This is here. This is not news. This is, if you remember, the very classic case in discussions about believing on evidence. There was the classic Clifford paper where
Yeah.
he talks about it's always everywhere wrong to believe on inadequate evidence. What he was getting at is I can do moral damage to you. I can certainly put you at moral risk if I don't believe on adequate evidence. So the thought is you can hold me morally responsible if I actually have evidence but don't form my beliefs in accordance with it. So I sell you something knowing full well that this thing is dangerous, but I never tell you anything about this. Maybe I don't tell you because I decide I'm just going to ignore all of the evidence that I actually have, and I'm
Yeah.
just going to form the belief that it's safe. You can hold me morally responsible for failing to live up to epistemic standards. So the answer is yeah.
Is that only if the consequences are dire? You know, I'm thinking maybe in less extreme cases where health isn't at risk, but Oh, I've thought about Clifford a lot because I wanted to apply it to rational inference and say, like, if you see that there's two premises and you see that they both that this argument is valid and that both premises are true, you should affirm the conclusion. And I'm trying to figure out what kind of norm that is. Like,
It's clearly a norm of logic.
yeah,
If you actually, if you assume two premises and the premises imply the conclusion, then you can think it's a norm of logic that you should endorse, that you should embrace the conclusion. Although some people, we have to be careful here. You probably know this literature. There is a distinction we might make between wide scope and narrow scope. It might
mhm,
be that what logic tells us is not so much that you should endorse the conclusion as you should never endorse both of the premises without endorsing the conclusion. And
yeah,
then it's going to leave it open whether what combination, what acceptable combination we accept. So it could be that that's what logic tells us.
yeah.
Um,
Well, and so there is a norm there between the premises and the conclusion. It seems like, but it's a different type of norm than the interpersonal. Can we hold people responsible for seeing those two premises and actively trying not to affirm the conclusion? Like, I'm just trying to get like the ethics of inference here.
Good. It's a nice question. It, can I just play the philosopher for a second and just make it more
Please,
complicated before I
yeah,
answer, which I
absolutely.
apologize about doing this. So it raises lots of questions. One is the question whether, forget logic for a moment, whether epistemic norms are, whether they can ever make, there could be such things as epistemic duties, or
Yeah.
rather whether all epistemic norms do is give you permissions. Many people think that epistemic norms are merely permissive.
Hmm.
Um, and the only things that they allow that they forbid are doing things that are not permissible. You're actually asking whether they can actually mandate whether that you believe. So not merely permissions, but requirements. That's a stronger view. And the second question is, and this is another big question that many people have thought about. David Christensen here comes to mind. What is the relationship between the norms of logic and the norms of epistemic norms, norms of belief, if you like?
Yeah.
Those are both complicated questions. So your question is complicated by both of those. I mention this because it may well be that what one takes on your question is going to depend on how one answers those two previous questions,
Hmm.
if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I do.
Um, but now let me not play the role of the philosopher and try to answer your answer your
Well,
question. Yeah,
that's really, really helpful when you do that. I love that. Just real briefly, I don't wanna overcommit. I wanna because I don't wanna go back and fall into doxastic, voluntarism and say, like, "Look, if I don't see it, I don't see it. Make yourself see it." Well, now we're getting into non-rational stuff and it's a problem. But rather, if somebody tries to suppress the belief in the conclusion, they're actively trying to put themselves in a position where they wouldn't believe it, and it's like, I would wanna say you ought not do that.
good. So let me give you another case that's not your case, but I think might shed light on it.
Awesome.
Imagine that there is a very salient fact about our environment. So in Evanston, once a month they have this is old fashioned, but they still have an alarm that goes off throughout the entire city. It also happens when we have when there's more than 2 inches of snow, and to signal that everyone should get their cars off the street. There's a very loud siren. Now imagine that
Did you
someone.
hear that today?
I did not. We actually
Oh,
have a
okay.
40. I think it's 45 degrees today, so it's lovely.
Oh, nice. I
Um,
heard the tornado alarm, I think,
uh,
today for
no,
out
I
here, yeah.
we did not hear anything like that. But so imagine that someone actually says to you, "Yeah, I've never heard that before. I've lived in Evanston all my life. I've never heard that." We might well say, that's strange. That's really weird. And we might not even believe them. And we might think that if they didn't get, all you have to do really is be anywhere where you're not in a vault, and you're going to hear that. And
Hmm,
that might be a case where we would say, well, you should have heard it, where that should is not merely predictive, but also there's a sense in which, look, this is the kind of thing that we just hold everyone to in Evanston, given how pervasive it is. That kind of "you should have done that" is an indication of the kinds of expectations that we have of ordinary people.
yeah.
I'm thinking what you're getting at in your logic case are the kinds of expectations we have of ordinary reasoners. If
Mm,
you actually see P and you see if P then Q, if you see that, we're just going to expect that you're going to infer Q, or else you're going to give up one of the. If you're not going to infer Q, you'll give up one of those two premises.
yeah, yeah. Um, that's good. That's really good, and Yeah, that's good. That's good. We can leave it there. So going back to like practice based, you give some recognizable cases, and I thought we could further elucidate this with different professionals whose expertise
Exactly.
rationalize our reliance on them.
Yep.
So yeah, what do you think? What are some professions that do this for us?
Yeah, any profession on whose knowledgeableness we rely, I think, is such a profession. And what's
Uh,
interesting about these professions is that they often have explicit norms of what they expect of professionals. So think of a doctor. More specifically, think of an anesthesiologist. More specifically, still think of a pediatric anesthesiologist. It may well be that there's the College of Anesthesiology and the College of Pediatrics actually have explicit norms about what kinds of knowledge is expected of doctors. That's one of the reasons why when you go to a pediatrician or a pediatric anesthesiologist, you're going to expect that you're going to be treated up with the level of confidence that's warranted by whatever the state of the art is in that area of medicine. It's precisely because you are expecting them to be not relevantly knowledgeable. Or think about going to a lawyer, or in general, and this is one that's gotten me very interested recently. Think of the phenomenon we call expertise, whatever form it takes. Um, the notion of an expert is someone who has a kind of knowledge that is or can be available for if you like non-experts or lay people to rely on. But in relying on it, there must be some kind of practice wherein we can be filled with a sense of confidence that our reliance is not going to get us into trouble. And
Mhm.
these are the norms of the social practices we have of relying on experts.
Yeah.
And what those norms will of course depend on what the practices are, will depend on what the type of expertise is in play. Does that make sense?
It does, and you anticipated. I wanted to go in on norms and how we determine those. I think in cases of doctors, and the even more fine grained you go, it becomes very explicit because there's all sorts of laws. I think about the expertise phenomena, and I think about philosophers. Um, Guys like Roger Scruton said, he had this kind of norm where he thought it was like preposterous that a philosopher could study just a really small area and have no political opinions. He was like, well, if you're a philosopher, then you need to have the full range, the full scope of beliefs. Whereas others would say, no, that's not how we do things, and that's not the state of play. And that's maybe back in the 1800s, but we're different now. So when things are contested like that, how do we and you'd have to define philosophy, and good luck, um, when they're contested within the enterprise, within the field of expertise, who's to say, how do we adjudicate the ought to know or the should have known principle? Someone says you should have known, and you say, well, that's not within the scope of it, continental analytic divide, who knows?
Yep. Yeah, it's a good question. What to say about these cases when there's expert disagreement? I'll point out that expert disagreement it raises many problems for epistemology and for social epistemology. There's some really superb work on this by lots of folks. So for those of you who are interested in it, just do a Google search on the epistemology of expertise. You'll find lots of great work. My 2 cent opinion on this, and I say 2 cent because I haven't thought about it as long as I'd need to have serious confidence, um, is that when there's serious disagreement among the experts, then it's not true in in most cases. It won't be true that there's anything that one should have known, precisely because the state of knowledge itself is in flux. So you can only level a legitimate should have known claim against someone or charge against someone when there is something they should have known, when that is, there's something there to be known. My worry about serious expert disagreement is that there's nothing to be known precisely because of the disagreement among experts. In
Uh,
cases where there's expert disagreement but something is known, those are going to be more complicated, and there you might well get a should have known. I don't know really right now what I'd want to say about those cases, but that is a case whose possibility I acknowledge.
okay. Yeah, the disagreement stuff really freaks me out. It's so tricky, so
Yeah,
tough.
yeah.
Um, okay, so getting back into practice generated entailments, is it just this question of why is it that playing certain professional or institutional roles gives one epistemic responsibilities? Um, it makes sense when we think about, this doctor, of course, they're a doctor, they should have known. It
Yeah.
makes sense when we just kind of take it for granted, but when you try to analyze it, it's like, did this person, when they passed their exam, or when they shook the president's hand and they walked across the stage, now they threw their hat in the air, now they're a doctor or whatever. Now do they have these, practice generated entailments
And sorry,
already?
entitlements. Yeah.
Entitlement, sorry,
Yeah.
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 Do they have them when they throw the hat in the air? I don't wanna bring up, the vagueness problem or anything like that, but I'm just wondering, is it a fuzzy concept or something?
Good. Let me answer your question indirectly.
Mm,
First, by giving you a sense of a concrete case where I think um, the expectations that we have of people are clear. So imagine that I'm talking with someone at a dinner party, and I'm having problems with one of my drain pipes, and somebody announces that she's a plumber, and she says, "Here's your problem." Okay, now I haven't hired her, so that's going to be a complication. Suppose I then go on to hire her. I hire her in part because I expect that she knows about plumbing.
mhm.
That expectation is in part predictive. I predict because she is a plumber, she will know, but it's not merely predictive
Yeah.
because if she doesn't know, I don't just conclude, oh, I guess I was wrong. I conclude, oh, I guess I was wrong. And by the way, she did something wrong. There was something bad that happened here. That's
Mhm.
the normative expectation. What entitles me to that expectation is the fact that she announced that she's a plumber, and I hired her under that rubric. So
Okay.
your question is, okay, so at what point in her education does it become true of her that there's a lot of things that she should know as a plumber?
Yeah.
And that's a great question. The partial answer I'll give you is once she is certified as a plumber, she now inherits all those responsibilities.
Mm,
Question: what about before that time? That can be a hard case. I'm not sure what to say there. It depends on what the educational practices are. It may well be that she can be held responsible for certain things under certain circumstances by her teachers, although not yet by the public.
yeah.
It's going to be very complicated, but certainly by the time she gets the degree and hangs out a shingle and says, "Come hire me as a plumber," she inherits all those responsibilities.
That's good, and that doesn't seem like an arbitrary solution to the Sorites paradox, because that's the social, rule. That's what we do. That's why we give out
Right.
certificates and such.
That's right.
I As you were explaining that, I think I more fully understood, when the, should have known, phenomena is raised. It seems like when there's dissonance between, prediction and norms.
It
I
it can get there. I mean, there are lots of cases where it can be raised. Really, the cases where it's raised is when I have a responsibility. That responsibility requires that I know something and I don't know it. And where does that responsibility come from? Another person's legitimate expectation of me.
Yes.
That's when it gets raised. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Um, I hope this isn't, I hope this doesn't put a target on your back or anything. So just heads up. But how about when can someone come to expect you to know what a philosopher knows? Um, is it once you've some people say, a PhD is just, an excuse to is just a license to do philosophy. Some people say that about PhDs in philosophy. Um, do you think that's similar? Is it similar to the plumber case that once you have the PhD, you have the duty, or is it once you become a professor of philosophy? What do you make of that? Just off the cuff.
That's a it's probably the answer is probably none of the above
Mm,
for reasons that are maybe a little complicated. But let me see if I can. Philosophy is a hard one in part because if you ask, what does a philosopher know? Well, do I really know? Suppose I have a theory in epistemology or a theory in philosophy of language, what the case may be. Do I really know that my theory is true? Well, even if my theory is true, and that's already a big if,
yeah.
even if it's true, you might think, and in fact, this is something that I try to defend elsewhere. Um, we don't know it because there's just too much disagreement in philosophy. Disagreement actually leads to a situation in which none of us is justified in thinking that our theories are true, at least not in cases where there's systematic disagreement. That will complicate the question about what we are entitled to expect philosophers to know. That's
Okay.
something specific to philosophy. Nevertheless, you ask, there's another dimension to your question that strikes me as interesting. Is it just getting the PhD, or is it becoming a faculty member? Getting the PhD actually is a kind of social signal. I think you're right to point that out. It's not entirely obvious to me that merely in virtue of getting a PhD, you entitle other people to make expectations of you about what you know as a philosopher.
Mm.
Maybe you entitle them to expect you to um, know a little bit about what it is to get a PhD. Maybe, I'm not sure about that. Certainly, once you are hired in virtue of your PhD, someone is paying you in virtue of your PhD, then you start inheriting these responsibilities that you have to live up to. So
Mm.
that's another way in which I think your question is a nice one and it's a complicated one. Sorry, Parker,
Yeah.
I don't know that answered it. It's just I
No,
complicated
it
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 again.
it 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 complicated it, but it brought up another point I wanted to ask you about, which is, there's different categories of these should have known cases. There, you lay out in the paper, at least, there's professional, institutional, and personal. And, the most obvious cases seem to be, the institutional ones. When an institution has deemed you, a certain type of person, then all these come with it. The personal is the one that's the trickiest, I think, for me,
Yep.
to understand. And maybe that's the case. Like, what ought we know, and what ought we expect from one another? Professional is a little bit easier too, because you got job descriptions, and
Right.
so if you sign on to that job description and you don't know what you ought to know for that thing, then now we can start holding. We can say you should have known.
Right. Yeah. So here I was inspired by an article that was written some time ago by a philosopher by the name of John Gibbons. I forgot the name of the paper. It was in Mind some time ago, where he noted something that actually struck me as very, very common. He had a case where there's a couple, two people who are they're in an intimate relationship. They've been living with each other for a long time, and they've developed a practice of leaving sticky notes on the refrigerator when they need something. And
Mm.
one of the members of this couple goes to the store without having consulted the note, and so fails to know that they needed milk. Had he consulted with the sticky note, he would have seen it. He didn't, so he didn't buy milk. Comes home, says, "I didn't buy milk," and the partner says, "But you should have known that we needed milk." Even though he didn't have the evidence because he didn't consult with the sticky note, John's intuition was that his belief that they didn't need milk was defeated by that evidence that he could easily have had. The way I like to put it is not the fact that he could easily have had it; it's that he was properly expected to have had it.
Yeah.
So here's a thought for you, Parker. In our in our relationships with one another, we develop these practices of relying on one another and relying on what each other knows, where if you violate that practice, they're often, as you pointed out, it's not usually made explicit
Yeah.
until the moment when someone violates it, and then
Right.
you'll have a conversation about it. But I do think that we have these expectations of our friends, of our family members, and so forth.
Yeah. And I keep raising bringing in all the tricky stuff from outside, but I think of, like, the is ought problem, which is a hairy, tricky, crazy situation. I understand, but yeah, like you said, they're often not made explicit until they're violated, and then you get this. Well, look, if we had never talked about the sticky note situation, we just started doing it. It kind of became a practice. I d I was under the impression that we don't always check those. You were under the impression that this was a stated thing, like, w of course you have to check these notes, and so I go, "Look, we never talked about that," and now we're back to adjudicating, my norm, whether this was a norm or whether this was just a fact of history that we had done this.
Right, a regularity that we relied
Yes.
on, but without being entitled to rely on. These are really good questions. What one of the challenges here is how difficult it is to argue about norms and normative
Yeah. Yes.
expectations. I think what I would say from the perspective of the theory, and I think this is actually a nice little prediction, is that insofar as it's not clear whether this was really a practice or just something that evolved with neither one of us really relying on it in the right kind of way, to precisely the degree that that's unclear, it will be exactly as unclear
Mhm.
whether I was entitled to rely on you or you were entitled to rely on me. So it will be exactly as unclear whether the should have known allegation is true or false.
Yeah.
So whatever fuzziness there is in normative expectations will be matched perfectly by fuzziness in should have known allegations.
Yeah. That's really helpful. I we need epistemologists in the court, I think, because I can just imagine people bringing this stuff up on Judge Judy, and like, she should know, she should read your paper before she gives her judgment, because this is super applicable. The institutional cases make more sense, even professional stuff, but some of the maybe small claims court judges
Well,
need
just
to
a
read this more.
couple quick comments here. One, should have known actually is a notion in the law. It's you'll often see in the law either if the person either knew or should have known. That's a very common phrase in the law. What's interesting about the law when I looked into this is that it never got a systematic explanation for
Mm,
what should have known meant, and so there have been several lawyers who actually have reached out to me and asked me, could my notion, and I told them I think that there are cases where this is a nice explanation of the should have known in the law. The
okay.
other thing I wanted to mention, this is just to give a shout out to my colleague Jennifer Lackey, whom you mentioned earlier. She has done some superlative work in this connection, both in the epistemology of law generally, and also thinking about what kinds of things are relevant where people should have known them, and if they didn't know them, what implications should we draw? So I just want to plug her work because I think she's done some really, really marvelous stuff in this regard.
Yeah, so awesome. I love that people have reached out to you. That's what I meant earlier when I said, like, I think philosophers need to be. I think people need to consult philosophers more often, because we literally pay you guys to just think all day. So use them, use the thinkers. I love it, and I love when it can have practical implications and applications as well. I love the abstract. As you've seen, I keep pulling you into the more abstract, and you give me these concrete cases and bring me back, which is nice. But just to further bolster the fact that philosophy is practical and ought to be used in everyday life as well. Um, so Sandy, you talk about epistemic reasons to believe, and how it could be dissociable, or separate. It can be separated out from practice generated entitlements. Can you define that for us, and then help us see why those two are not the same thing, or how?
Sure. Yeah. It's simple case here. Not from my paper, but just easy to see this. So suppose, my kids are all out of the house now, but when they were younger, my partner and I might say things like, "We expect you to be home by 11 o'clock tonight." And when we stated that expectation, that was clearly a normative expectation. You can imagine that my partner and I, when we talk about it, we recognize that we have all sorts of reasons to think that our kids are just not going to live up to the standard tonight. We are really dubious that they'll be home by midnight or by 11. We might still say to them, "We expect you to be home by 11." Um, so that shows you that there are reasons to believe. If you ask us, do you have reasons to believe that your kids are going to be home by 11? She and I might say, no, we actually have reasons to believe they're not going to be home by 11. We're still entitled as their parents to expect them to be home by 11. So the thought is, you can get really nice dissociations between reasons to believe and entitlements to expect, in any case where you might have reasons to believe that people aren't going to live up to what they're responsible to living up to. So that's where you get these dissociations.
Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah, that's really helpful. So I wanted to see if we could apply this into a different field, and specifically philosophy of religion. Most of my audience are students in theology or philosophy of religion, master students usually. But I got a lot of PhD students as well, and some professors as well. And I just thought your work is so good. I want to put it out there into other fields, and I thought maybe we could apply this in philosophy of religion, if we use like Russell. Bertrand Russell, someone asked him, Mr. Russell, what happens if you die and you see God? What do you say to God? And he says, not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence. And I wonder if we could apply this here, and to say, like, on the conditional that God does exist, um, could he have an entitlement to expect Russell to believe, even though he didn't have the evidence? Let's take Russell at his word and say, he just didn't have enough evidence.
Yeah, that's a nice question. It's actually very, very theological, and so I'm on very shaky grounds because I am no theologian.
No worries.
But so the question that I'm going to ask is actually a slight variation on your question.
Hmm.
Does my theory predict that God would
Yeah.
have an entitlement to expect? Um, and there, the answer is going to depend on what we think of as the relationship that we have, or the practices that we have up and going. My inclination is to be somewhat skeptical, because I do think, first of all, I should mention, and I mentioned this to you ahead of time, I am an atheist, so I'm
Hmm.
entertaining this for the sake of argument, but
Yeah.
but it's not my normal way of thinking about things.
Yeah.
Even if I were a believer, I would the theory would predict that it's only if there's something that entitles God to expect that of us. In this case, the best case I could think of might be a moral expectation. The
Hmm.
challenge from my mind is when I think about moral expectations, I think of them as the kinds of things that arise in interpersonal relationships. I
Yes.
don't know whether they generalize to the God human relationship. So there are all sorts of questions that would have to be answered before you could actually come up with an affirmative, yes, God would be entitled to expect us to know.
Yeah. This is so helpful, and I think because you're an atheist, and I forgot the language you used. Uh,
Uh,
do you remember?
that I'm sad that I'm an atheist.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
wish that I could be
yeah,
a
yeah,
believer. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Which I
reluctant I think was the term that I used.
reluctant,
Reluctant
reluctant, and
atheist. Yeah.
yes, yes, and I love that. I love that's why I wanted to ask you about this because we get an outsider perspective instead of just talking to theists all day. Um, John Schellenberg has this hiddenness argument. Are you familiar with that at all? I don't expect you to be, but
You should probably go over it. I mean, I've heard of
yeah,
it, but I
he's an atheist philosopher in the philosophy of religion space, and he says, if God did exist, then he'd want a relationship with, he'd be open to a relationship with anyone. And so, if that were the case, there wouldn't be anyone who is an honest unbeliever who would have a relationship with God if he exists, if he would make himself known. That person wouldn't exist. But there are people that exist who kind of like yourself. Actually, you said you're reluctant. If God would show Himself to you, maybe you would believe. And so because Sandy exists, maybe God doesn't exist. And so that might be a case that look, you'd need to solve that hiddenness problem in order to establish this interpersonal relationship in which there would be entitlements that God could have on you. But
yeah,
that would mean that you would have the evidence, right? You would have evidence of God's existence, and so it might not be the same case that you're
it
talking
would
about here.
mean there would have to be evidence, not necessarily that I would have it, but that there would have to be
Ah,
evidence. Yeah, yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Would it have to be interpersonal evidence in like a relationship with God, or could it be like what theologians call general revelation that God's uh, there's signposts to him in nature, the cosmological argument or teleology, such?
Yeah, I don't know that I would put any restrictions on the evidence, whatever kind of evidence, as long as it really is evidence, there would have to be evidence. And then my flaw as an atheist in this case would be that I didn't get the evidence that I should have had, which had I had it, I would have known that God exists. That's the way I would analyze these cases if they are possible. Again, I tell you, I'm not sure that they're possible from the
Sure.
perspective of my theory, just because of these complications with where would God get these entitlements from? But if that can be solved, that's the way I would think about it.
Yeah. Well, and I thought this could be an interesting new debate between naturalists or atheists and theists of every different stripe to say, look, even if he does exist, I'm not entitled. He doesn't have an entitlement. He doesn't have a claim on me to know that he exists. It's on him. And then the theist can say, well, no, it is, and back and forth. And I just think it's one more case where your work has application in practical matters. Maybe you say philosophy of religion is not as practical, but yeah, it's a large field, and I think this is really fun stuff.
Well, I really appreciate, Parker, your attempt to see the practical dimensions of my work. As you pointed out, this is certainly something that's true. I will say of me, and I don't speak for her, but certainly my colleague Jennifer Lackey as well, and many others. I find that as I get older, I want to do two things. I want to both think about how the hours that I spend my day thinking about these theories bear on real life,
Yeah.
and I also want to make sure that I and others return to the joys that brought me into philosophy in the first place. And often those two things go hand in hand. So
Hmm.
I've really enjoyed. I do continue to think about, as you call them, the abstract questions, but I really get a kick out of thinking about how can these things actually apply to everyday life. Um,
Yeah.
it's one of the reasons why social epistemology is so interesting to me, as so many people have seen in the last 5 years or so. It's applicable. There's a social epistemology dimension to so much phenomena, that so many phenomena that it's fun to think about.
Well, and that's what I was about to just bring back up. You keep anticipating all these points. It's great. But your work on social epistemology, it's so cool because it's so interpersonal, and there's like a I don't even know how to describe it. There's like a good feeling that I get from thinking we depend on each other for knowledge. We depend on each other That's why I like Donald Davidson's triangulation argument, like with
Hmm.
whether it's true or not. A lot of people say it's not true, but you would. How do I know how do I know I'm not a brain in a vat, or how do I know that there's other minds? Well, because I had to have other minds. I need other people in order to be who I am today. And I think that's what's so cool about your work is that it shows that we are social creatures, that we're not just a brain on a stick or whatever like that, but we actually need each other, even for knowledge.
I appreciate the compliment. I want to give one out as well to another philosopher who um, I just whose work I just have always admired in this respect, and that is the late Catherine Hawley. She tragically passed away last year.
Hmm.
She has done some unbelievably thoughtful work on the nature of trust, and in thinking about the nature of trust, she has front and center the idea that we so depend on one another that our ways of thinking, our moral ways of thinking, our epistemic ways of thinking are bound up with our mutual codependence in many ways. And she was an inspiration in this respect. So I can't help but hear her name and her voice when I hear your appreciation for this kind of social epistemology. And it's really one of the biggest losses for philosophy that she passed away last year.
Yeah.
She was a colleague of mine at St. Andrews.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks for honoring her there. So, Dr. Goldberg or Sandy, what can people be expecting from you lately? What else? You're obviously working on this. What else can we look forward to you producing?
So I'm very one of the things that I am trying to do is I am always trying to think about the ways in which the things that I think about have practical application. So I actually have started trying to think about more public facing philosophy as you're talking about. That is something that we'll see if that's successful or not. That is something that I am going to try to do. In
Hmm.
addition, I am always obsessed with the questions that arise in social epistemology regarding our dependence on one another. The form that that's taken in the last year or so is that I'm doing work right now with a colleague at another university, Karim Khalifa, who is actually a philosopher of science. He and I have started a bunch of papers trying to think about how social epistemology can be applied to certain questions in philosophy of science. And I continue to be interested in speech act theory, in the
Mm.
ways in which we put normative pressure on one another in our speech exchanges. So that's also something that I've been thinking a lot about and continue to write about. So those are the areas where I continue to think and write.
That's awesome. Yeah, and you super productive. I could learn a thing or two from you, like just the
You're
way
very
you
kind.
answer emails and send notes, and it's been really awesome interacting with you. Um, Sandy, do you have a website that people can reference for more of your work?
I do, and in fact, if you want, I'm going to look it up right now. It is
Sure.
on the Northwestern site,
Okay.
and the actual full. Let's just go to the Northwestern site, and the full name is philosophy.northwestern.edu /people /continuing faculty /index.html #G.
Okay.
So if anyone doesn't have it, you can just go to the philosophy department at Northwestern. And it can be found right under the faculty list.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll put a link in the description there too. Sorry to make you read out that whole thing,
Yep.
but everyone, you can find it wherever you're getting this podcast at. Well, Sandy, this has been awesome, man. I really appreciate it. For those who have liked this conversation, go back and check our episode on Brain in a Vat. I'll also put the link in the description here. You can find an end note if you're looking on YouTube here. That's going to have to do it for us for now. But Sandy, seriously appreciate all the work that you're doing and for taking time out in your hugely, massively busy schedule to come on and talk with me and school me on some philosophy.
Parker, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me back. I enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. That's going to have to do it for now, folks. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.